Welcome to Biodiversity Week at Interagency Desert State Park. We'll begin our presentation in a couple of minutes. Welcome, everyone. My name is Danny McCamish. I'm the Senior Environmental Scientist at Colorado Desert District at Interagency Desert State Park. We'd like to welcome you all to the closeout of our Biodiversity Week here. And to do that here, it's too hot to kind of come out and join us in the desert to take a walk. But what we wanted to do is bring to you some of our biodiversity over this live webinar scenario. The Interagency Desert and Colorado Desert have over 50 herpetofauna species, amphibians, and reptiles. We wanted to highlight one of those today, the flat-tailed horned lizard. So joining us is Craig Fischer, a former California State Parks environmental scientist, a former colleague of mine. Craig earned his master's at San Diego State University, studying the effects of translocation on flat-tailed horned lizards, and is now a PhD student at the Clark Lab of Conservation Ecology and Animal Behavior for UC Davis and San Diego State University. Currently, he is studying flat-tailed horned lizards, their genomics, and his doctorate is pursuing that. So I'll turn it over to him and let him give his little presentation on our biodiverse lizard population, specifically the flat-tailed horned lizard. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you very much, Danny. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to sharing with you all my work today. So let me pull my screen up. And we can begin. So I first want to say I have built this little blue box in the corner, although it may not be necessary since you guys are seeing this over Facebook, but the presentation, the presenter view can go up into the corner while I present on this fascinating animal. So I'm going to talk to you all today about the flat-tailed horned lizard, Phrynosoma macallii. It is one of the more fascinating creatures that inhabits the Colorado desert. Like Danny said, I am a doctoral student at the University of California, Davis and San Diego State University in Reuling Clark's Animal Behavior and Conservation Ecology Lab. I've worked with this animal over the course of the last 8 years in various capacities. And today I'm going to give you a little bit about the natural history, a little bit about the conservation issues and the research that goes on around this animal. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity to answer any questions that you might have. I'm keeping it fairly broad, so when specific things come to mind, just type them into the chat, and the moderator at the end of the presentation will go through them and we'll do our best to answer some of those questions. So let's get going. So I'm going to walk us through first the geography, where you can find this animal, kind of what the Colorado Desert is. We'll then talk about the animal itself, life history traits. What does it do? How does it reproduce? These types of things. We'll talk a bit about conservation concerns. We'll talk about ongoing management of the animal and research opportunities, both things that are currently happening as well as specifically the work that I'm doing. We'll wrap it up with some conclusions and then we'll have an opportunity to field some questions. So let's get rolling. When we talk about the Colorado desert, it's, I think, really easy to get confused. It's a bit of a misnomer because none of the Colorado desert reaches into Colorado, as you can see. The Colorado desert is in fact a western segment of the broader Sonoran desert that runs into western Arizona. And the Colorado desert is so named because the Colorado River winds up, or it used to empty into the Sea of Cortez above ground here. And the influence that the Colorado River has had on that region has really shaped the geology as well as the flora and the fauna, but also the human use of that area over the course of thousands of years and more currently in recent history, as we'll get into with things like agriculture. So when I say the Colorado desert, we're referring to this western section of the Sonoran that is particularly dry and particularly hot. What are some of the other features that define the Colorado desert? Well, like most deserts, we know it to be very sandy. Due to a lot of the geology, the history of the area, there's lots of fault lines that run through the Colorado desert. Between that and the influence that the Colorado River has had on the region for thousands of years, the landscape is very rocky with lots of different geologic features and types. And ultimately, this desert is very sparsely vegetated because of how hot and how dry it is. And so you have shrubs that punctuate the landscape with lots of sandy and gravelly interstitial space where annual wildflowers can grow or problematically invasive weeds. But it's throughout this space that the flat-tailed horned lizard resides. So where specifically, though, can you find flat-tailed horned lizards in this region? Well, in the valley bottom habitats, they occupy a lot of different habitat types. So washes, dune edges, flats with ephemeral sand dunes. So on the valley bottoms, they can be quite abundant. But as you get closer to the mountains and those sandy flats begin to turn into rocky, sort of succulent cactus scrub, you stop seeing the flat-tailed horned lizard so much and you start seeing more of their sympatric species, the desert horned lizard. And so these flat tails are really relegated to those Colorado desert, sandy, flat valley bottom habitats. So geographically, what this means is you'll find them in Southern California through the Coachella Valley up north, the Borrego Valley to the northwest, and throughout the Imperial Valley. Into Arizona, they just barely eke west of the Gila Mountains here, and then down into Mexico, west of Laguna Salada, and north of the Sea of Cortez, and to the east as far as the habitat permits as it cuts south. So what is it doing on that landscape? So like so many creatures, in an effort to survive, these animals have developed a life history characteristic that can be described as crypsis. And so this is partly an evolutionary trait where selection over thousands and thousands of years has made it such that the ones that survive the best are the ones that blend into their environment the best. And because there's so much open space out here, visual predators have an advantage. So the more you look like your landscape, the more likely you are to survive. So to start, these guys are excellent hiders, expert hiders. They will bury themselves beneath sand for any number of reasons, including things like thermoregulation. Of course, lizards, like all reptiles, are ectotherms, meaning they get a lot of their energy from the temperature around them. The warmer it is on the ground, the faster the lizard is able to move and behave. The colder it is, the slower and more lethargic it will be. So they can use the sand to regulate their body temperature. They will also use the bright sunlight and warmth to regulate their body temperatures. So it's not uncommon to find them in the morning sunlight, basking on rocks like this fella, taking in that sunlight so that they can do things like run around and find mates and find food sources and do things like I mentioned before, like avoiding predators. These, as most abundant critters on a landscape have to contend with, they are the source of food for a whole slew of predators. You have things like this ambush predator, the sidewinder rattlesnake, that will eat small horned lizards. You also have faster moving snakes like the coach whip that is known to try to eat horned lizards. Those are pursuit predators. You have avian predators like the loggerhead shrike, which is the butcher bird, which is known for its particularly gruesome method of impaling its prey on sticks and fences to consume them. It's a songbird, but also things like falcons and hawks or roadrunners love these guys. Coyotes and kit foxes, bobcats. Avoiding predators is how these guys spend a lot of their time. And one of the best means they have to do this by is, again, concealing themselves in the sand. I don't know if you saw the head of this horned lizard down here, but if they're buried in the sand, the likelihood of visual detection by predators is much lower, allowing them to survive much better. As far as its food habits go, Phrynosoma macaulay, this flat-tailed horned lizard, is much more of an ant specialist than most horned lizard species. And so harvester ants comprise a tremendous portion of their diet, along with periodically, opportunistically, a couple of beetles here and there. And like any other critter, it's got a prime directive to procreate and create more lizards. So this is how the flat-tailed horned lizard spends a lot of its time. It's eating, it's avoiding predators, it's looking for mates, and just generally trying to keep it together. So let's talk about how those habits and the landscape it lives in kind of intersect with the human activity in that area. What you have outlined in blue here is the estimated current range of this animal, and the dashed lines indicate what could have been former range. This is not super specific. I'm more using this visual as a point that human activity has really cut out what's estimated to be in California about 50% of their habitat. It's been completely converted. In 1905, the filling of the Salton Trough, because of human activity along the Colorado River, removed quite a bit of habitat. And in the years around that, as this part of the country realized the agricultural potential of the soils that this area has had deposited over millennia by the Colorado River, it's become an agricultural staple for the United States. And so both north of the Salton Sea into the Coachella Valley and south of the Salton Sea down to Mexico and the Imperial Valley, quite a bit more flat-tailed horned lizard habitat has been completely converted, along with the municipal development of cities like El Centro, and up north in Coachella, Palm Springs, Palm Desert, Cathedral City, all the way down into La Quinta and Indio. So this really paints a picture of wide-scale habitat conversion, which is somewhat of a problem if you're a lizard with a very limited range. And like so many other animals, the world around, these aren't the only habitat conversion. It's not the only threat to this animal's persistence, including things like climate change, the effect of invasive species on the landscape, off-road recreation, which is abundant throughout the range in Southern California of this animal, clean energy projects and mining, as well as direct road mortality caused by highways and roads that separate certain sections of its range. This whole picture has led to a number of institutions recognizing this animal as an indicator of Colorado desert habitat health. And this animal is being particularly sensitive to those changes happening on the landscape. And so starting in the late 80s, there were petitions and have been continually to list this animal as endangered. And the institutions like the Center for Biological Diversity, who are tasked with, trying to maintain biodiversity hotspots throughout the US and use endangered species legislation to offer protections to these animals, has led to the organization of a lot of conservation and management centered around this animal. And effectively, in 1993, a federal attempt to list the animal led to the establishment of a committee to help start really building some baseline population and research data for this animal to better understand how it's doing and how it's persisting on the landscape. So in 1997, this Interagency Coordinating Committee, you might see that I've used this acronym FTHL. Anytime you see that, I'm referring to the flat-tailed horned lizard. And the ICC, I'm just throwing so many acronyms at you, is this Interagency Coordinating Committee. So you have scientists and land managers from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Arizona Game and Fish, the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, the Department of Defense, which has both Navy and Marines institutions on flat-tailed horned lizard land or habitat, and California state parks like Anza Borrego. These institutions created this committee to start building a foundation on which conservation and management of this animal could begin. And the critical piece of the critical thing that they created that has driven management of this animal now for over 20 years, or for approaching 20 years now, is the range-wide management strategy. And this is a document that outlines the life history of the animal, the threats to persistence as we know them. It establishes best practices for conservation and management. It facilitates and identifies research needs. Like any conservation program, the most critical component of that is land acquisition to mitigate the conversion of available habitat. There's also things like a development cap for signatory agencies. And they also established long-term monitoring protocols to start really teasing apart population trends in a meaningful way for the first time for this animal. So what this looks like on the landscape is you have here in yellow this whole section, which is the former range or the estimated former range of the flat-tailed horned lizard. And outlined in red are each of these management and research areas as built into that range-wide management strategy. So you have the Borrego Badlands, which are managed by Anza Borrego State Park, Ocotillo Wells State Vehicular Recreation Area. The other California State Parks Institution manages an 85,000 or so acre research area. The West and East Mesa management areas have joint management between the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of Defense, as well as the Yuha Basin Management Area. And the Yuma Desert Management Area is monitored and researched quite heavily by Arizona Game and Fish. So this committee has really institutionalized the conservation of this animal in an important way. And what they're doing, so in each of these management and research areas, they've stratified a whole bunch of research plots. And what they do on these research plots is they perform these population studies every year, where they go out and they're collecting the type of data that can help them understand things like abundance, how many of these lizards are on the landscape, density, how many per landscape or per land unit, survivorship, sex ratio. We know that females, because they carry so much higher reproductive potential, have an outsized impact on the population compared to males. So knowing the relative ratio of females to males is very important, and things like local extinction rates and range-wide extinction rates. All really critical data to understanding the populations of an animal well. And so what this looks like long-term when you collect this data is you can start to establish patterns in their populations. And what you can see here on the left is these are the results from the ICC's monitoring. This was a paper published in 2015, and it shows what we understand is a boom and bust population cycle, where you have years of things like drought, which might contribute to a lower population year. And as precipitation comes in waves, then you get the opportunities for the vegetation to really produce more seeds, and the ants will then in turn be able to build bigger, more robust nests, which allows for, you know, higher reproductive output by the lizards. So you have then the resulting boom in the population. So boom and bust population cycles. And only through this long-term research effort have we been able to start to kind of piece together the trends in this animal's population. And while this is all well and good, it has been, this is built off of the range-wide management strategy, which incorporates all kinds of research that's happened on this animal over the course of the last 40 years, even more. And all of this information, trying to understand which habitats they're using, what are their reproductive trends, what are the impacts that some of the activities in their habitat have on their persistence, and how can we best use statistical tools that exist to estimate these parameters that we're interested in, like abundance or density. And so for years, we've been trying to understand a lot of these things, but we really still have a very broad picture of how this animal interacts with its landscape, and things like reproduction potential are still broadly unknown. And so we have 2 studies ongoing, Arizona Game and Fish, as well as the Good Lab at the University of Arizona has been targeting things like how many eggs does a female carry? Can a female carry 2 clutches of eggs in the same year? How many of those eggs actually hatch at the end of the season? So basic elements of this animal's biology are still relatively unknown, which brings us to the research that I'm doing. So my work focuses on how we can use modern genomic tools to better understand the biology of this animal as it exists. So to start broadly, I can't just throw a word like genome down and pretend that everybody's got a good grasp on that. So to keep it simple, the genome encompasses all of the genetic information you have in your cells. So as humans, we have 23 sets of chromosomes, and each chromosome contains all this wound up DNA tightly packed. And that DNA is comprised of nucleotide sequences, those letters that code for genes. And this is how your cells do things, is you have machinery that can read that template and that can produce things like proteins and just help maintain yourself as an individual biologically. So the genome encompasses all of that stuff, every bit of genetic information that an organism has. What can you do with that information? Well, it's kind of a treasure trove, actually. It's so fine scale that you can look at things broadly, like evolutionary history. How is this animal related to similar related animals, other horned lizards, other lizards in the same family? Then you can get more specific. You can look at family history relatedness, so parentage, which individuals are producing offspring, and how are certain individuals contributing to the gene pool as a whole. And you can get really specific with it and start looking at things like adaptive genes. Which genes do populations have where there's lots of diversity that will allow the animal to persist in a changing environment, compared to neutral loci on their genes, which are uniform effectively across the populations and don't provide the opportunity for development and change in that type of changing landscape. So genomics are absolutely the kind of this next generation of biological research, and applying it to the flat-tailed horned lizard could be a really useful model for conservation, particularly in reptiles. All right, so how do we get there though? We have genomic analysis, we have the genome. How are we getting to that point at all? How do I even get to the genome? Well, we do a small tissue collection from the tail tip. We take a teensy bit of blood from the animal, and then we extract the DNA from that blood sample. And from there, we send the DNA sample off to get sequenced. And when the sequencing work is done, they send it back, and I get a data file with gigabytes and gigabytes of letters. It's this very boiled down, just these nucleotide sequences that tell me nothing and everything all at once. And what I mean by that is when you look at these sequences of letters, it's sort of inscrutable, but there are software programs that you can use that are basically looking at different individual mutations along those sequences. And you can use those individual mutations and the likelihood of those mutations happening to assume things about the population and to learn about how related it is to other individuals, or how heterozygous or diverse a certain gene is throughout a population. So what's the kind of mission here with the flat-tailed horned lizard and doing work with the genome? Well, things that would be interesting, of interest to land managers, to things like the ICC, that Interagency Coordinating Committee that I was talking about, things like effective population size. You can get a sense of how many individuals are actually contributing to the population by producing more individuals. Are different populations connected? Is there genetic diversity between seemingly disconnected populations? Are there certain parts of certain landscape features that are preventing genetic diversity from really expanding? So those you'd call those sinks or sources of genetic diversity, where you have really high diversity and lots of individuals that are allowing dispersal into the landscape to increase the genetic diversity for the animal and its populations. So these are the types of things that are useful to land managers in looking at persistence of this animal long-term on the landscape. So for my study, I've been working in the Western Imperial Valley. The things that I'm looking to accomplish with this project are to prove the efficacy of genomic sampling, to use all those bioinformatics analytical softwares to show how establishment of some of these parameters can really help inform and guide management decisions. To organize tissue banking. So this would involve sending these tissues to be kept at a museum long-term, so that for years, those individual tissue samples can be used by researchers, even outside of the scope of this project alone. I want to create a genomic data pipeline. And what I mean by that is I want people who don't have expertise in genomics or in these analytical techniques to be able to apply the data sets that they would receive and understand the trends that are coming out of it without necessarily having to get into all the muck of the theory and the specifics. And ultimately, I think most powerfully, this tool can be utilized to really bolster the efforts that have been ongoing for decades now to understand this animal institutionally. So this Interagency Coordinating Committee is spending a lot of time and effort collecting samples and doing this research that has really been a boon to the conservation and management of the animal. And adding a genomic component would allow for longevity and research for years. People will be able to ask specific questions using these samples. And I think it would really bolster the efforts in an important way long term. So this brings us to what has been the end of my field season. Just a couple of weeks ago, I capped off a season I collected about 65 samples, which is a wonderful start. And I think more importantly, it was a great opportunity to expose lots of undergraduates and volunteers to this really great conservation work and this complicated system in a landscape that is really, I think, underappreciated. The Colorado desert is beautifully diverse. It is stunning in its sparsity and in its aridity. You have animals that have just adapted to these insane conditions, and exposing people to an area that I think most write off as a kind of a wasteland is a really critical step in getting people to care and want to work with this animal. And giving undergraduates the training and experience will hopefully allow some of those individuals to pursue their own careers in this field as well. So coming up, I have 2 more field seasons of data collection. So I'll be back out in the Imperial Valley next summer and the following. We are working in an effort to expand to the border wall to take samples from the Uha Basin, and then on the other side of the US-Mexico border wall to look at any effects that Highway 2 or the border wall itself may have on the genetic relatedness of individuals on either side. There is lots of data analysis that needs to happen, as well as the establishment of that data analysis pipeline. So lots to do in this project still. And I'm really looking forward to it. And so along the way, I've had a ton of help. This kind of thing never happens just by one individual. The Department of Defense, which is allowing me to use their land to perform my research, has been incredibly helpful. All of the ICC stakeholder agencies have been supportive over the years and facilitated getting this work off the ground. I really want to thank Anza Borrego Desert State Park for having me on here today for the California Biodiversity Day events. My advisor, Dr. Rulon Clark at San Diego State, and my collaborator, Dr. Matt Good over at the University of Arizona, who both of them have provided a lot of guidance and expertise and have really helped move this project along. So thank you all for coming to my talk. This has been great, and I'm happy to field any questions you may have now.
All right, thanks, Craig, so much for sharing your research and all of the background. You've got a lot of love coming through on our Facebook page. For those that are joining us on Facebook, if you have any questions, feel free to type those in. We're going to start off with a question that we have. We've been focusing here on our flat-tailed horned lizards. And in Anza Borrego, you can find both flat-tailed horned lizards and desert horned lizards as well, sometimes, pretty in close proximity to each other. What are some of those main differences that we can identify each species?
Yeah, that's a great question. The animals do look quite a bit alike. They are similar in like size and shape, of course. Some of the things that set the flat-tailed horned lizard apart, one of the main ones you can see in this picture here that I have, all 3 of these flat-tailed horned lizards have this dark stripe down the back. It's called a dorsal line. And the desert horned lizard does not have that. A more challenging feature to identify, because you typically have to have the animal in hand, and unless you have handling experience, I don't recommend holding these. I especially don't recommend holding the flat tail, as it is protected in California. But this fringing along their sides, the flat-tailed horned lizard has 2 layers of fringing, one over top of the other one, and the desert horned lizard has just 1 layer of fringing there along the side. Some other things, even though there's lots of variation in the color, the desert horned lizards do tend to have a little bit more orange in them and whites, whereas these flat tails are a lot sandier with some kind of muted oranges and greens and silver colors in the tail.
Nice. Thank you for explaining that for us. And in your pictures of where these horned lizards are hiding in the sand and camouflaging so well, I can imagine it takes a lot of patience and practice in finding them. Are there any, skills that you have or tips for how you go about identifying them?
Yeah, you're totally right. They can be very challenging to find. As I discussed early, that's their whole strategy, right? They hope you don't see them, and that's why horned lizards, more than most other species, are prone to freezing in place when you approach them. So a lot of lizards, as you approach them, their strategy is to just run as fast as they can away from you. The horned lizards hope you don't see them, so they remain still, which can be very helpful. But it can make them very hard to spot. And so some of the things that I've gotten good at are you're just looking for, like in a landscape that has lots of rocks on it, you kind of scan the tops of the rocks and you get a good idea of sort of how the normal landscape looks or how a rock edge looks. And as you sweep your eyes across, when your brain catches something that's just not quite right, it'll let you know, and you can kind of then go scope out what you think might be, often it ends up being a horned lizard perched up on a rock. Or one of the most helpful tools is if you have sand available to them, they're quite easily tracked. They have very diagnostic tracks that they leave in the sand, and sometimes those tracks will lead you right to a little dimple where you can just see, like, there's no tracks away, there's tracks in, and there's just a dimple in the sand, and there's something hiding under there. And so the tracks can really be a useful tool.
Nice. So we have a question coming in wondering, are there any mapped effects on the lizards from invasive plant species or pollution from the New River or degradation of the Salton Sea?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, not so. Sahara mustard is one of the primary, the really deleterious invasive species through this animal's range. It's really abundant. It produces a ton of seeds, and there have been actually ant studies that show that ants they actually won't eat the Sahara mustard seeds. And so as the Sahara mustard is occupying space that annual wildflowers typically would be, because it can outgrow those wildflowers much earlier and become so big that it excludes the wildflowers from growing, you're decreasing the seed load for those ants. And theoretically, you would expect that to reflect in the size of the ant colonies and then the ability of those flat tails to consume the ants. On the other hand, you have things like Russian thistle. While it also outcompetes things like dune plants, it provides valuable cover to the animals in spaces where there isn't a lot of cover. And so invasive plants are kind of a mixed bag. I don't know of any research that discusses the impact of like the New River or the Salton Sea. I think a part of that is due to the fact that along the edge of the Salton Sea, you no longer have a lot of valuable flat-tail habitat due to roads, geothermal projects, the agriculture that runs all the way up to the south and north ends. And so, yeah, it's hard to say, and I don't think there's been any studies targeting those particular effects.
All right, thanks, Craig. And one last question from us. A lot of our younger students and visitors here know that some species of lizards, a defense mechanism for them is squirting blood out of their eyes because of those ants that they eat. Is that something that the flat-tails do?
Sadly, no. There are a number of horned lizard species that lack that capability. They can't spray blood, and the flat-tailed horned lizard is one of those species that cannot spray blood out of its eyes. However, the coast horned lizard that you can find in and around San Diego does do that. And I've never gotten to see that before. It is apparently more easily elicited by mammals, things like bobcats and coyotes, and they don't do it quite as much for humans. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. But good question, because that's a really, really unique adaptation in horned lizards.
Thank you. And I believe we've got one more question here from one of our Facebook viewers, prefacing it as a pretty loaded question. But as we think about the larger climate crisis we're facing right now, how does the understanding and research on horned-tailed lizards and flat-tailed lizards help to inform our responsibility to biodiversity? And why should the quote unquote regular person care and get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. Climate change is one of those things that is leaving, essentially no system, no biological, ecological system untouched. It definitely has variable effects on certain areas, and on the desert floor, those effects are have the potential to really be pronounced because you have wildlife that is already living at like thermal and water limit extremes. And so the question of climate change as it pertains to vegetation communities is important in every vegetation community. And even there's been research to show that, for instance, Ocotillo, the plant that looks like pipe cleaners that's so iconic to Anza Borrego and the surrounding region, there's research suggesting that they are sort of moving up in elevation. And the changes to these landscapes long-term will determine I think, the effect and the persistence of this lizard. And why should people care is a tougher question, because I think there's people have an innate love for things outdoors and wildlife. It's hard to put a finger on, but why you should care about the persistence of any given species is because these things are all so interconnected that as one piece falls away, it's hard even for us to conceptualize what impact that'll have on the other parts of the system. And so as things like Sahara mustard proliferate and remove native annual herbs, we're seeing these things have effects that we don't necessarily know yet. And preserving these systems as they are is, I think, important to us as stewards of the landscape, who have the potential to keep these things as much as we have the potential to destroy them.
Wow, thank you for that. And we've got one last question we definitely want to answer. One of our Facebook followers says, sometimes we camp on trails in and along drainages of Anza Borrego and other places in the Sonoran and Colorado desert. Do you have any tips for ensuring we aren't impacting this wonderful species?
Yeah, excellent question. Road mortality is a tough one, and especially when you're off trail, it can always be fun. Part of the fun of getting off road on the desert is being able to kind of tear through and really go fast. And I think the best way to avoid things like accidentally hitting these animals is to just be watchful and to enjoy your kind of exploration of these spaces at a slower rate. But part of that, I think also, if you know the seasonality of the animal, can help. So like I said, from like November through February-ish, they're mostly underground. You'll still have some like juveniles, smaller individuals that are growing and need to continue to eat. They might be above ground most of the winter, but your chances of hurting these animals are much lower during the season when they're kind of underground. So they are active from February through September, October, and then individuals start to sort of go into holes, and for two months or more, they'll sort of hunker down and estivate or brumate or hibernate, however you want to say that. And So during those time frames, you can be a little loosey-goosier, but as it warms up in the spring and as you start going out to adventure in the fall when temperatures get nice, just be watchful and you'll actually be surprised at how much other cool stuff you see. When you're going slower, you get a chance to see a lot of these lizards that are the fringe-toed lizard, which is similarly really neat, has this beautiful, intricate black and orange webbing pattern on its back. Zebra-tailed lizards, which have all kinds of cool behaviors you can watch. So, I'm always a proponent of when you're out there, just go slow, just keep an eye out for things. And when you see stuff like this in the trail, they'll often scramble a little bit and then they'll stop and you can hop out of your car and go check them out and sort of shoo them on their way and all will be good.
All right, thank you. So we're gonna come back on screen here. If I could have you stop sharing your screen. Perfect.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Thanks for answering those questions. And thanks for taking your time on a Saturday to join us to help educate everybody on Facebook. We really appreciate it. That was very interesting.
I'm very glad.
Everyone tuning in, this will be up. Yeah, this will be up on our feed on the Facebook if you all want to watch it at another point in time. But thank you all for joining in. Thanks for your questions and participation. Go out and take a hike and enjoy the remaining day of biodiversity.